Welcome to this holiday edition of the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. I am John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Media commentary columnist Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Hi, John.
Washington commentary columnist Matthew Cottonetti. Hi, Matt.
Hi, John.
And senior editor Seth Mandel. Hi, Seth.
Hi, John.
So we are answering listener questions here at the end of the year, the beginning of the new year. And we have a couple today that I would like to toss out to the panel for your general perusal. And they're a little personal today. So the first comes from Josh Strike, who says, I'm a frequent listener. I was born under Carter on the cusp of Gen X and Gen Y. I personally draw a more important line between people who had smartphones or social media as teenagers and those of us who were a little too old to. I get the sense that John is the eldest of the band. That sense is entirely correct by about 10 years at a minimum. And his references are usually to growing up in the 60s and 70s. But I'm curious which generation each of you feels the most affiliated with, how being part of or in opposition toward your generation affected your political temperament, and also whether it makes a difference in the long run or whether all generations end up the same. What an interesting question from Josh Strike. So, Abe, as the second oldest here, perhaps you could explain yourself generationally.
I feel as if I'm sort of the last generation to use payphones to have used payphones for a huge portion of my life and planning and socializing. So forget about smartphones. I go back to payphones. I think in a lot of ways that, so I was born in 1971. I think in a lot of ways, people of my generation grew up in a world that was more similar to the world of the 50s than it is to the world of today. Yet, I've spent half of my life in the world of today. So I feel very torn. I think, unfortunately, I go through life criticizing the generations that have been raised with smartphones while in embodying all their worst habits myself.
I think it's funny because John is 1961, you're 1971, and I'm 1981. Well, so it's kind of this staggered by decade there. And I've always kind of identified more with Gen X than with the millennials, which I'm technically a millennial. But if you get super specific in this kind of generation theory or theology, I'm an edge millennial, which means I'm, closer to Gen X. And I think if you have memories of the Reagan presidency, then you're probably Gen X more than a millennial. And I do have memories of the Reagan presidency, of course, kind of dim ones, and they happened when I was pretty young. When you say that you saw the Challenger explode in your kindergarten class, that you were kind of a youth, a wastrel during Reagan's time. But I'm more Gen X than millennial.
As conservatives, I think we all feel as though we are out of step or influenced by things older than the contemporary, or have been morally framed by things older than our own contemporary experiences and cultural landmarks and things like that. The greatest expression of this, of course, comes from the greatest English poet of the second half of the 20th century, Philip Larkin, who in his poem Annus Mirabilis said the sexual revolution began in 1963, which was just too late for me between the end of the Chatterley ban and the Beatles' first LP. The Chatterley ban being the ban in England on D.H. Lawrence's novel Lady Chatterley's Lover for being a work of obscenity, something that is almost unimaginable to think about now that, you can basically access, like people having sex while eating crickets on your computer, like this was a thing that was where one of the great writers of the day could have a work suppressed on the grounds that it was obscene. But the whole point is being out of step, out of joint, and not quite there with the things that were happening that were liberating, that seemed liberating to people. And every moment over the course of the decades, people have these illusory senses of liberation from the shackles of the past that we then discover maybe some of those shackles were there for a reason, and that loosening them meant chaos rather than a greater degree of freedom. Not all of them, but also that a lot was lost when you replace the old with the new. Christine.
So this is where I'm going to jump in and make my pitch for why I was born in 1973. So Abe and I are both Gen Xers. You're way too modest about our amazing generation, Abe. But this is where I think Gen X is unusual, because we lived through some massive social shifts, the latchkey kids, higher divorce rates, a real cynicism about a lot of it that was pervasive in the culture at a certain point. And instead of, I think at the time, I remember as a child following cultural discussions and debates, we were aware that something was being lost at the time. And I think it's what's made us, at our best, very cultivate a very healthy skepticism, whether it's about new technologies, new forms of political leadership, new kinds of expressions of culture. At our worst, it makes us so cynical, we just shrug and go, oh, well, no, we can do nothing, where it's nihilism, basically. So there is that constant tension. But Gen X really is this strange hybrid, if you look at it in terms of how we consume information. We remember the old ways. We remember the pace of the old ways. So I think it's why it made us the kind of dark horse in the most recent election. Gen X went for Trump. And a lot of people were shocked by this who aren't in Gen X. I was completely not shocked by that at all, because there's a sort of shrug and like, well, we resist. The generation has tended to try to resist the extremes. It's like, is democracy going to end? That's ridiculous. Is it okay to drink warm water out of the hose? Probably not, but it's the only option. There's a kind of acceptance, world weariness that I remember some of my friends having when we were all like 13. So I will make that defense. There's a group of us here in DC, organized by my wonderful friend Andy Smarrick, and we get together for sort of a Gen X conservatives lunch. And among Gen Xers who are conservative, it's really fascinating to hear people's intellectual journeys, how they got to conservatism, because they're very meandering paths. There doesn't tend to be some moment of deep radicalization. And I would make a pitch that it would be nice to see a Gen Xer in a leadership position at the national level in the near future.
Well, it's interesting because that Josh Strike in his note to us, says this offers this delineation between the smartphone generation and the generation before smartphones. But I think all of us have some version of the smartphone that we just missed, that I think we don't feel was a miss at all. And in my case, it was video games. Now, this may sound like very little, and I played video games in my dorm room, in my dorm's basement at the University of Chicago, Space Invaders and Frogger and games like that on machines you put in quarters, and that was the thing. But the gaming that went home and that people did at home, I was 3 or 4 years too old for. And I genuinely don't know what would have become of me had I fallen into that world. Now, I know a great many people who were gamers and have grown into very fine middle-aged adults whose lives weren't delineated by their basement rec room with that TV and those games and getting ever and ever more complicated. But knowing my own personality and knowing how I sometimes consume culture, I feel like I dodged a bullet not having been old and having been able to say, this is a whole thing I'm not even going anywhere near, because it just seems to me like a giant, colossal waste of time. And the more engaging it is, the more time you waste at it. And a lot of things are waste of time. Being a sports fan is kind of a waste of time. There are things that you could sort of define as wastes of time.
I mean, as a Jets fan, I can.
Well, that's certainly that's it's been 50 years since it wasn't a waste of time to be a Jets fan. 55 years since it hasn't been a waste of time.
The video game thing is actually very interesting because Matt and I are the same generation, almost the same age. We're like a year apart. I have, being part of that generation has actually, or that part of that generation has made me not believe in generations, sort of, because we for a long time we were known as elder millennials, which was a way of saying we were not really millennials. But we also didn't have the same experiences that Gen X had. We were like, Matt and I were like, we're part of like a 3-year generation. We have like, there's like 3 or 4 years when all of us are like, and it'll never be named. And then they changed that from elder millennial to, they tried to change it to geriatric millennial, because elder millennial was deemed not insulting enough to us. So there's like, we're sort of looked at as like the camp counselors of millennials. It's a weird situation. And that has always shown me that it's really the trends and the time differences, age differences are much bigger than generational differences. And I had employees that were technically within a generation of me, but were like from another planet. That really hit home. You know, if somebody worked for me who was like 6 years younger than me, it was like my nephew. It was like they came from a totally different planet. But the video game thing is interesting because in our generation, was that my generation, the geriatric millennials, I like edge millennials, as Matt said, were the generation of Nintendo. Nintendo was invented and released when we were just born. We were only a few years old. So we were sort of present at the creation of that. That changed everything with video games. I also played, Frogger and stuff like that, because until a couple of years after Nintendo was really out, when you went to your friend's house, nobody had a Nintendo. They did have Ataris left over from whenever, and so you did play those games.
Commodores, yeah.
Yeah, but the games, I played as a kid. I liked video games, and then I always thought that video games were sort of, modern video games are a bit too. I'm not sure I have the attention span for them. But then I had kids, and what I did was I did something very interesting with the kids. My kids got really into playing Super Mario Run or something like that on my wife's cell phone, which is just a game where Mario is running from the beginning, I guess. And, the early cell phone games were just like, you don't control the movement, you just have to control the jumping or whatever. And anyway, they got into Mario and the characters, and they thought it was cool. And I explained to them that this thing they're holding, this phone, Mario is decades old, and that I used to play on a console, and then I had to explain what a console is, and with a controller, and then I had to explain what a controller is, because if you were born in the touchscreen generation, you don't even understand attaching a wire to the thing you were controlling.
You could also just get them to switch.
So eventually,
switch, and that will explain it.
That is what we did. But what we started with is I said, I showed them, I did a Nintendo emulator on my computer, and we started with the first Mario,
but why
and then the second Mario, and third, and we went
this is
all
where
the
the
way
Gen
up
X
through like
the
the
instant
Switch
gratification
era
of, like, just
Marios to take a tour of how much things had really changed in that time.
See, and this is why I'm glad I don't even know about Mario, and I don't know about Atari, and I don't know about and all this, because, and it's, by the way, rap music also came in later. I mean, first rap, of course, real hip hop started in New York City when I was a teenager in the 1970s, but it really hit when I was in my 20s. And That's, again, in all of modern popular culture, which a lot of people would consider me an extraordinarily informed person. That is an entire branch of the culture of which I have absolutely no experience whatsoever. But generationally, and then we should move off of this, the reason that we think about generations is itself anomalous. So I'm a baby boomer, and the reason that we think about generations is because of the baby boomers. The baby boomers represented a completely anomalous moment in world history where, coming back from the war, victorious war, America as the most powerful country in the world, this surge of optimism and self-confidence, and this population of 16 million people who had served in the military and wanted to come home and get on with their lives and make new lives and live a life of purpose and meaning and with family and all of that, created this population bulge. And then all of American culture, capitalism, everything became dedicated to servicing it, because it was so big, and there was so much of it, and suddenly there was music dedicated to it, and there was television dedicated to it, and there were products, breakfast cereals and Saturday things that were sold on Saturday morning cartoons and all of that. And we still talk about generations as though, well, that was the baby boomers, and then there were the Xers, and then there were the millennials, and then there were the Yers, and now there's the Zers. But those generations are not, they are completely knock-on, just normal, the product of normal population growth and people having children and stuff like that. And trying to come up with generational consciousness when there's no real reason for generational consciousness, except as a marketing tool for Madison Avenue and corporations to say, this is how we're going to get a 17-year-old to start using our product.
Well, but there are generational cultural markers, and I can't believe you did not have any sort of experience with Rapper's Delight, because that was like 1979. That was Sugar Hill Gang. That was the beginning of the. But there are cultural markers that I wonder, particularly for Gen Z, given how fragmented popular culture is now and how niche oriented, if they will even see themselves in the same way as a generation, in the way that all of us did, because we were kind of grandfathered into the culture.
But I hope they don't, because I don't think it's a proper perspective on society, or on, you don't actually have any particular connection to people.
Well, but the animosity that Gen X has towards the boomers, for example, is completely justified, because you guys just won't get off the stage, and
it's just totally deserved. I apologize.
No, but I do think
for my generation's horror, nightmare, narcissistic, cultural detritus. Like, we have very little to praise ourselves.
The millennial generation was a large generation. So I do think the size, in terms of just the scale and the cultural impact and the cultural production of each generation, we're now living in a parasitical relationship with the culture produced by the boomers. So when everybody complains about the boomers, I do like to remind them of that fact too. But I do think size matters. And I think that with the millennial generation, their impact on culture was far greater in some ways than Gen X, just because there were more of them.
Okay, let's move on to a question. Everybody doesn't have to answer this if you don't have an answer, but it's sort of an interesting question from Connor Dennison. Tell us about an encounter with a person that left an indelible impression on you. So obviously that could be anybody. It could be a teacher. It could be a famous person. It could be a politician. It could be a writer, whatever. Anybody have?
I have an answer.
Yeah.
Just trying to date it. I think this was somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 years ago. I was at the bar of the Gramercy Park Hotel, and I met Bill Withers. And it wasn't just that I met Bill Withers. He was incredible. He told me about how he wrote Lean on Me when he was in the armed forces, and he had sort of snuck into a supply room that had a piano, and he just put his hands on the chords and dun 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 dun, and went up and down, and that ended up being Lean on Me. And then he took this very eccentric idea for a movie that he wanted to make. And then his daughter showed up, and he introduced me to his daughter, and she was lovely and amazing. And it was just one of those experiences where I said, was this a dream? What was this? Did this happen? He was great. He was incredible. So
your positive story means that I have to use the negative story that I was contemplating. I had a positive one, but I'm going to go with the negative one. And that is when I went to Columbia and showed up in 1999 there, I wanted to be a creative writer. I thought I would be a fiction writer. And I had started writing, people who listen to the podcast regularly won't be surprised. I had started writing science fiction stories and sending them out and everything. And one of the appeals of Columbia was that there were some prominent writers who worked there. And among them was a man named Kenneth Koch, who was a very prominent poet and a member of the New York School of Poetry, which included figures like John Ashbery. And probably the most famous of them was the poet Frank O'Hara. And so I thought, okay, my plan was, and I wasn't a conservative or anything at this time. My plan was I'm doing my writing, doing my reading. I'm going to meet Kenneth Koch, and he's going to become my mentor, and this is going to be my entree into the New York literary scene. And at that point, I went to a poetry reading by Lawrence Ferlinghetti, one of the last he ever gave on the Lower East Side and everything. So that was this is what I wanted to do. So I submitted my stories to Professor Koch for his creative writing class. And we had to have a meeting with him during office hours to see whether you would get in. And the meeting did not go well. And he was the most arrogant, selfish, condescending person I'd ever met. And he said, I've read your stories. You need to sober up before you can be in my class. And so I left and
Matthew Continetti, famous goofball,
decided not to become a fiction writer, but to become a journalist, and became a conservative. So take that, Kenneth Koch. Look what you did.
A, I loathe Kenneth Koch's work. B, Kenneth Koch also famous for being an anthologist. He was one of the people who gathered the poetry of the second half of the 20th century in various anthologies and did a terrible job of it. And yes, he was famously unpleasant, and is now been completely obscured by history and will long be forgotten while you will be admired and remembered.
Don't know about that part, but it was an indelible. You asked for an indelible encounter, and I will never forget it.
Okay.
I will use. I'll also go in another direction and use a childhood encounter. Probably the thing that stayed with me the most. My encounter was about how things shape your impression of them when you're a kid. And we were staying at an airport hotel on our way to Disney World when I was a kid. My parents took us, me and my two sisters, and we were all staying in one room overnight. It was like the night from hell. We refer to it as it was everybody in the same room. And at one point we heard that somebody told my father that the Indianapolis Colts were staying in that hotel because they were playing the Jets the next day. So they said, why don't you go down and see if you can find a Colt or whatever. And we took I think that we had our just a hotel pad in case I got autographs, whatever. And I went downstairs and we waited, we didn't see. Finally, some giant men came out of a room. And I was like, they've got to be football players because they're, and I was really little. I was really very young. And I went over to them and I asked them, can I have I didn't even know who they were because it was like, a linebacker and an offensive lineman are like, these are like giant humans. These are the ones are football players. You don't always know the wide receiver or the running back is a football player by looking at them. The guys are the guys who are more likely to be sort of anonymous. And they the first one who took it sort of grunted in assent, and I had to hold the pad while he signed his name and kept walking through the lobby and out into the rain. And so I was like, I don't know, like, 5 or 6 year old Seth, and I was doing this because a giant
This
football
meaning
player.
Seth is
Oh
holding
yes,
his
I'm right.
hand,
I'm
holding
on
the
YouTube.
pad in his hands
I'm holding the pad up
horizontally,
as if I'm like
vertically.
pushing something, like
Yeah,
like bench
pushing
pressing it or
against him. Right.
something,
Yeah.
because I had to hold the notepad, and the force is so great from this giant football human. And the chicken scratch, you couldn't even make out really who it was, but it was like this feeling of being among gladiators. This person like couldn't see me. I was like behind the pad. I was tight. He was looking straight ahead, and he would only interact with me as I held the pad, and he continued walking, and I walked out into the rain. That's how I got some of these guys autographs. And that stuck with me because football was cemented in my brain as this kind of gladiatorial
But you don't know who he
world.
was.
No, I don't even remember. I don't even
Oh,
somewhere. So we figured out. I think at the time, I think we figured it out. But he
right.
was a very famous player. But
Right.
it cemented in my head that unlike baseball players and other athletes that I, have met or seen up close or whatever, football players were like a species
Yeah.
of their own, and the mystique of football has held for me ever since.
Christine, you have anything?
I do. I have as our listeners know, I've played the bassoon since I was 8. I went to a music camp for 4 summers in Vermont. I think I might have shared a version of the story before, but the reason it continues to leave an impression is not for the random fortune of having met this person, but because of the world it opened up for me once I figured out who he was. And that's one of my best buddies. I was 12 years old at camp. I just turned 12 while at camp. And one of my best buddies was was kind of a absolute prodigy of a piano player, young man I knew as Iggy. So when concerts happened, the parents would come sometimes if they lived nearby and listen to our concerts. And so Iggy's like, my father's coming, you should meet him.
Oh
He's
my
coming to hear me
God.
play. So I go
I
up.
know who it is. Oh my God.
So after the concert, I go up and I shake this guy's hand. I'm like, man, Iggy's dad is kind of austere and he's old, but whatever. He was, he's perfectly friendly, said hello, said he enjoyed the playing. So I then tell this story on a payphone, Abe. I could call my parents like once a week. So I call my parents and I'm explaining, oh, I met so-and-so's parents. I met so-and-so's parents. My dad says, wait, who? I said, my friend Iggy, his dad, he has, I think he's Russian. I don't know. And my dad instantly knew that this was Alexander Solzhenitsyn, which it was. And I'm like, yeah, Iggy's dad. He goes, do you know who this is? And I was like, Iggy's dad. So he's like, okay, well, when you get home from camp, we're going to have a conversation about this. And you know what? It led to me starting to read Solzhenitsyn's work. And I was at this perfect age where, when you're 13, 14 years old, your world starts to broaden, if you're lucky, and you start to see yourself as part of a nation, as part of I just had never really thought through the dynamics of the world I was living in. And that opened this door into this entirely new universe of morality, of geopolitics, of history, and a door I hope never closes. But it all began because of this chance meeting with my goofy buddy at camp, who went on to have quite a really productive and wonderful musical career as a conductor and a pianist. But yeah, that left an impression, but retrospectively, because I really didn't know who he was at the time.
Well, nothing I can say can top that, so I think we'll end there. So, great stories. So for Christine, Matt, Seth, and Abe, I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.